The hostess looked up as the front door opened. "Good evening, sir. Welcome." Justice Elijah Carter smiled gently. "Good evening." No cameras followed him. No assistants carried his briefcase. His ordinary gray suit blended into the polished dining room, making him look like any tired customer searching for dinner. After a long day, he stepped inside. Quietly. Years of experience had taught him that. People often decided who belonged before they asked a single question. Courtrooms had changed. Laws had changed. Human assumptions often had not. The young hostess reached for a menu. "Just one tonight?" "Table for one," Elijah answered. "Of course, sir." Before she could move, a voice drifted from a nearby table. "Are you sure he's supposed to be here?" The words were soft, almost hidden beneath clinking glasses, yet they landed heavily. Another diner glanced toward Elijah without speaking. The hostess hesitated. I have a table ready," she said carefully. Elijah nodded. "Take your time." Across the room, the restaurant manager stopped polishing a wine glass. Instead of greeting the new guest, he simply watched. His eyes stayed fixed on Elijah longer than on anyone else entering the restaurant. "What table?" another employee whispered. "I don't know," the manager replied quietly. "Let's wait." The silence grew larger than the room itself. Elijah noticed every glance but betrayed nothing. He had lived through moments like this since childhood. Discrimination rarely announced itself with shouting. It arrived through pauses, suspicious looks, and people waiting for someone else to question your presence first. The hostess forced another smile. "Right this way." "Sir." Elijah followed calmly. Behind him, conversations resumed. But several eyes never left his back. Something had already changed, though nobody had spoken loudly enough to admit it. The smile on the young hostess's face faded as she glanced toward the manager, searching for reassurance that never came. Elijah remained beside the table she had prepared, patient as ever, while whispered conversations drifted around the room like an invisible fog. Instead of approaching his guest, the manager quietly disappeared into the office and closed the door. Moments later, he picked up the phone. "I need an officer here," he said in a low voice. "We have someone refusing to cooperate." No one had refused anything. Within minutes, Officer Derek Wallace stepped through the restaurant entrance, his uniform carrying an authority that immediately changed the atmosphere. The manager walked directly toward him, speaking before Wallace even looked across the dining room. "That's the man." Wallace nodded once. Understood. He never asked another question. He crossed the room and stopped beside Elijah. "Stand up," Wallace ordered. Elijah looked at him calmly. "Officer, may I ask what's happened?" "I said stand up." Around the restaurant, chairs shifted softly. One customer reached for a phone. Then another. Within seconds, tiny camera lenses pointed toward the growing confrontation, while conversations disappeared into uneasy silence. Elijah slowly rose from his chair. "May I know why you're asking me to leave?" "You're trespassing." "I wasn't aware of that. The restaurant has issued the order." Elijah met Wallace's eyes without raising his voice. "May I see that order?" For the first time, Wallace hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. "You don't need to see anything. You need to leave." The room became so quiet that silverware stopped clinking against plates. Elijah spoke gently. "I am simply asking for the document you say exists." Wallace's expression hardened. "We're done talking." Without another word, he seized Elijah's arm and pulled him toward the entrance. Every phone kept recording. Every witness saw the same moment. Almost nobody said a word. Officer Wallace kept his grip firm as he guided Elijah through the center of the dining room. Behind them, another phone rose into the air. Then another. Within seconds, nearly every angle of the restaurant held a silent witness. Some people recorded because something felt wrong. Others simply wanted a dramatic video before dessert. None of them realized they were preserving evidence that would soon outlive every excuse spoken that night. "Keep moving," Wallace said. "I am," Elijah replied evenly. A man near the window folded his arms. If the officer's removing him, he must have done something. His wife never looked away from Elijah. "Have you seen him do anything?" "No." "Then how do you know?" The man offered no answer. Another diner whispered, Look at him. He's not arguing. Maybe he knows he got caught. Or maybe he knows arguing won't matter. Those words lingered longer than the clatter of silverware. Wallace continued leading, Elijah between the crowded tables. The short walk somehow felt endless. Every quiet step exposed an old truth. Some people entered a room already trusted. Others spent their entire lives proving they deserved to stand there. The restaurant door opened and cold rain greeted them. Water tapped softly against the sidewalk as Elijah paused, just long enough to straighten his jacket. Wallace frowned. Don't make this harder. I have no intention of doing that. Elijah neither resisted nor complained. His calm frustrated the certainty Wallace carried into the restaurant. The officer expected anger. Instead, he found restraint. Rain darkened Elijah's shoulders, but he never reached for his wallet or introduced himself. Respect demanded by a title was temporary. Respect offered to a stranger revealed character. A growing crowd gathered beneath the awning across the street. Among them stood a young black woman holding a stack of law books against her chest. She stared through the rain, her breathing suddenly uneven. "No," she whispered. The book slipped slightly from her arms. Her voice trembled. "Justice Carter?" Nearby phones captured the words before Wallace even realized someone had spoken them. Silence cracked, and for the first time that evening, doubt entered the story. The words drifted through the rain. Justice Carter. For a heartbeat, the sidewalk disappeared beneath the weight of memory. Long before the tailored suits, the courtroom opinions, and the quiet respect earned across a lifetime, Elijah had been a little boy walking dusty roads in the Jim Crow South. His father never promised the world would be fair. Instead, he prepared his son for the days when fairness would fail. One evening, after a store owner ordered them outside without reason, young Elijah asked, "Why didn't you argue?" His father rested a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because I won't let their hate decide who you become." Those words became the foundation of Elijah's life. Years later, as a young attorney, he entered courtrooms carrying thick case files and quiet confidence. Judges greeted white lawyers with warm smiles while introducing him with hesitation. Before proving the law, he often had to prove he deserved to stand behind the podium at all. Every victory demanded twice the preparation and twice the patience. Harvard Law opened its historic gates, but not every heart inside welcomed him. Some classmates questioned whether he belonged. Professors occasionally overlooked raised hands that remained patiently waiting. Elijah answered every doubt the same way, through discipline instead of resentment. His career became devoted to families who believed justice had forgotten their names. He represented workers denied opportunity, children harmed by discrimination, and parents whose voices had been ignored for generations. Every successful case restored more than legal rights. It restored faith. Appointments followed. Federal judge, appellate judge, finally, a seat on the Supreme Court. The titles changed, but suspicious glances never disappeared completely. Elijah understood that prejudice could wear expensive suits as easily as old uniforms. His greatest victories never came from raising his voice. They came from refusing to surrender his character when others questioned his worth. The memory dissolved as rain continued falling outside the restaurant. The frightened boy had become a guardian of the Constitution. Yet strangers still saw only an elderly black man standing beside a police officer. Every hardship, every courtroom, every lesson from his father lived quietly inside this single moment. Elijah remained calm because his silence was never surrender. It was the discipline of a lifetime, facing one more test without allowing injustice to choose the man he would become. The young woman's trembling voice still lingered beneath the sound of falling rain. Justice Carter. The name hung in the air, but Elijah neither confirmed nor denied it. Instead, his quiet composure carried him into memories far older than the storm. As a boy growing up in the segregated South, he learned early that strangers often noticed his skin before they noticed his smile. Respect was rarely offered freely. It had to be earned repeatedly, even when kindness should have been enough. His father recognized the burden before Elijah could explain it. "Listen carefully, son," he would say while repairing worn work boots on the porch. "Win with character, not revenge. If hatred changes your heart, then it has already won." Those words became the compass guiding every difficult season that followed. When Elijah entered law school and later stepped into his first courtrooms as a young attorney, skeptical faces greeted him before introductions ever did. Opposing lawyers questioned his experience. Some judges looked surprised to see him standing behind the podium. Every case demanded more than legal knowledge. He had to prove he belonged before anyone listened to his arguments. Harvard Law opened doors that many believed impossible to reach, yet prejudice quietly entered beside him. Study groups formed without invitations. Conversations stopped when he approached. Excellence earned applause, but acceptance always seemed delayed by invisible conditions. Rather than pursue wealth, Elijah dedicated his career to families crushed beneath discrimination. Every civil rights victory restored more than legal protections. It gave forgotten people permission to believe their voices still mattered. Years later, his appointment to the federal bench made history, but assumptions remained stubborn. Outside the courtroom, strangers still mistook authority for someone else's privilege. Even after joining the Supreme Court, Elijah refused unnecessary attention. He traveled alone, dressed simply, and believed titles should never replace humility. Now, the memories settled back onto the rain-soaked sidewalk. The elderly man standing beside Officer Wallace was the same child his father had once, encouraged to protect his character above everything else. Decades of sacrifice had led to this ordinary restaurant. This ordinary evening and this extraordinary injustice, no robe rested upon Elijah's shoulders, no courtroom, announced his position. Yet nothing could hide the integrity that had carried him from childhood hardship to the nation's highest court. His title remained invisible, but his character never had. By the following morning, the rain had stopped, but the questions had only begun. Reporters crowded outside the restaurant, speaking with anyone willing to remember. One former hostess finally agreed to talk, her voice low but steady. People believed the place was fair because everything looked perfect. The dining room was beautiful. The rules weren't. She explained that many decisions were never written down. They lived in quiet habits, passed from manager to manager until they became normal. Another former server recalled the seating chart with visible discomfort. Whenever possible, certain guests were placed near the kitchen doors, the restrooms, or noisy corners. A reporter asked, "How were those tables chosen?" The answer came after a long pause. Management called it balancing the room. We all knew it usually meant black customers. The stories became harder to dismiss. Employees described dress code inspections that seemed strangely selective. One woman remembered a black businessman wearing polished shoes being questioned, while another guest entered wearing sneakers without anyone saying a word. The rules changed depending on who was standing at the entrance, she admitted. It stopped feeling like policy and started feeling personal. Former workers also described another pattern. If management wanted someone removed, one ex-supervisor confessed, they'd say the customer caused a disturbance. Were they actually disruptive? Sometimes. Many times, no. Evidence rarely mattered once the accusation had been spoken. A retired assistant manager revealed why written records were almost impossible to find. Anything sensitive stayed off paper. Conversations happened behind closed doors because documents leave trails. Many employees admitted they had stayed silent for years. I needed the paycheck. I had children. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. Every compromise protected the next. One inside the restaurant. Crystal chandeliers still reflected across polished marble floors, creating the same picture of luxury customers had admired for decades. Yet beneath that elegance had existed another system, one hidden behind smiling greetings and carefully folded napkins. As interviews multiplied, isolated memories joined together like missing pieces of one forgotten puzzle. Former co-workers who had never spoken publicly suddenly recognized identical experiences. Their private conversations escaped the staff room and spread across television broadcasts, newspapers, and social media feeds, without a judge issuing a ruling or management admitting fault. The restaurant's reputation began breaking apart. Reservations were canceled. Loyal customers questioned past visits. Employees who had once whispered behind kitchen doors finally spoke aloud, while executives realized the silence protecting them for years had disappeared almost overnight. The video continued spreading across the country, but another question slowly rose above every headline. Investigative reporter Daniel Brooks leaned forward during a newsroom meeting and asked, "Where's the trespass order?" The room fell quiet. Everyone had repeated those words for days, yet no one had actually seen the document. A routine request suddenly became the center of the entire investigation. The restaurant's legal team gathered inside a conference room overflowing with folders, reservation records, security logs, and employee reports. File after file was opened. Cabinets emptied. Computer archives were searched twice. Finally, someone whispered, "I can't find it." Another manager looked away without answering. The paper that supposedly justified everything appeared never to have existed. Journalists immediately requested emergency dispatch recordings. The audio revealed something unexpected. Wallace had reported a situation requiring assistance, yet the details remained surprisingly vague. No dispatcher mentioned a confirmed trespass order. No clear instruction identified Elijah as refusing lawful commands before officers arrived. Every replay raised another uncomfortable question instead of providing reassuring answers. Investigators then requested Wallace's body camera recording. A technician searched the evidence database before quietly shaking his head. "It's unavailable." "What does unavailable mean?" an investigator asked. The recording wasn't preserved. "Why not?" "I don't know." The missing footage created more suspicion than any existing video ever could. Reporters immediately recognized the significance. When the strongest evidence vanished, every remaining explanation became harder to believe. Meanwhile, restaurant employees returned for additional interviews. Their confidence faded with each conversation. "I thought the order had already been written," one hostess admitted. "I never actually saw one," another employee confessed. A server hesitated before speaking. "We were just told everything was handled. The stories no longer matched. Details shifted. Timelines changed. The carefully repeated version of events slowly unraveled beneath ordinary questions. Behind closed office doors, conversations became shorter and far quieter. What do we tell reporters now? Only what's confirmed. And what exactly is confirmed? Nobody answered. Online, millions of viewers compared official statements with Maya's original recording. They paused every frame, matched timestamps, and highlighted contradictions. Ordinary citizens became careful investigators, discovering inconsistencies that institutions had overlooked or ignored. Each comparison weakened public trust a little more. Officer Wallace continued defending his actions during internal interviews. "I followed procedure," the investigator simply asked. "Show us the order." Wallace remained silent for several long seconds before repeating, "I followed procedure." Outside the interview room, even longtime colleagues stopped offering confident support. Some walked past without speaking. Others quietly avoided cameras altogether. His certainty was beginning to lose its audience. What started as one disputed dinner had become something much larger. Without a trespass order, nearly every official explanation demanded fresh examination. Across the country, people asked themselves one unsettling question. If this document never existed, how many other stories had depended on paperwork nobody ever bothered to verify? The missing order no longer represented one absent page. It had become a symbol of trust beginning to disappear. Maya Johnson closed her apartment door and leaned against it, still hearing the rain striking the restaurant windows. Her phone remained in her trembling hand. She pressed play again. Officer Wallace's grip on Elijah's arm looked no different than before, yet every second felt heavier now. She whispered, "People need to see this." The decision frightened her, but silence frightened her more. She recognized Elijah the moment she heard someone whisper his name outside the restaurant. Every constitutional law lecture she had attended echoed through her mind, yet she refused to type his identity into the caption. "If people only care because he's important," she murmured, "then they never understood the problem." She deleted his name and stared quietly at the empty caption box for another minute. Finally, she typed only 4 words. No one deserves this. Nothing else. No dramatic music. No angry commentary. No arrows, circles, or edited clips. Just the original recording in 4 simple words. She pressed upload, exhaled slowly, and placed the phone on her desk. The room became completely silent except for the steady rain outside her apartment window. Within an hour, notifications flooded her screen. Thousands became hundreds of thousands. Comments arrived from strangers across the country. Many wrote, "Why was he removed?" Others asked, "Why didn't anyone help?" The questions spread faster than opinions, forcing viewers to watch carefully before reaching conclusions. By morning, attorneys were forwarding the video through private legal groups. Did anyone hear a lawful order? Was probable cause ever established? Where is the trespass documentation? Law professors paused lectures to discuss the footage. Judges quietly requested copies. Civil rights organizations began preserving every available version before anything could disappear. Inside television newsrooms, producers leaned closer to glowing monitors. "This isn't just another viral clip," one editor said. "Find the police report. Get dispatch recordings. Talk to restaurant employees." Meanwhile, Officer Wallace watched the growing headlines from his patrol car and shrugged. "It'll disappear in 2 days," he muttered. His partner glanced at the phone. "I'm not sure about that." Wallace tossed the device aside without another look. Back at the restaurant, conversations sounded different. Servers avoided eye contact. A hostess quietly asked another employee, "Do you remember last winter?" The answer came almost as a whisper. "I remember more than last winter." Across social media, people replayed the encounter repeatedly. The louder voices slowly faded. Instead, viewers noticed Elijah's patience, his respectful questions, and the complete absence of resistance. Confidence in the official story weakened with every replay. By nightfall, millions had watched the recording, yet almost nobody knew the elderly man's identity. They only knew what they had seen with their own eyes. Maya understood then that truth needed no introduction. Sometimes the strongest evidence carried no famous name, only an honest moment that refused to disappear. Growing public pressure leaves internal affairs with little choice but to review Officer Wallace's record. Investigators approached the assignment cautiously, aware that reopening old complaints could expose years of overlooked decisions and uncomfortable institutional failures hidden beneath official reports, forcing long-delayed accountability into the open at last. Despite internal resistance, Sofia Ramirez studies complaint after complaint with fresh eyes. Unlike previous reviewers, she refuses to dismiss repeated accusations as coincidence, slowly recognizing familiar details appearing again and again across cases involving the same officer. Every similarity demands another question, another file, another uncomfortable comparison nobody previously wanted to make honestly. Separately, each complaint seemed minor or inconclusive. Together, repeated language, familiar accusations, identical behaviors, and matching timelines revealed a troubling pattern, suggesting isolated incidents were actually connected pieces of a larger institutional failure, protected through routine assumptions instead of careful scrutiny for far too long, unnoticed until now by everyone. Dust-covered folders contained statements from citizens whose concerns were quietly dismissed years earlier. Reading them today, Sofia realized many described nearly identical experiences, yet every warning disappeared beneath paperwork instead of receiving meaningful attention or accountability. Forgotten voices suddenly sounded impossible to ignore any longer inside the department's walls today. Retired officers, no longer dependent on department politics, quietly admitted Wallace received unusual protection throughout his career. They described supervisors minimizing complaints, discouraging deeper investigations, and treating public criticism as a problem to manage rather than misconduct to confront. Despite private doubts, leadership kept shielding him until undeniable evidence surfaced. Inside the department, colleagues who once defended Wallace became noticeably quieter. Conversations ended whenever investigators entered rooms, while supportive voices gradually disappeared. Officers recognized that continuing public loyalty could damage their own credibility, leaving uncertainty to replace confidence across every hallway and briefing after each new revelation from now onward. Sophia noticed the same approving signatures, appearing throughout Wallace's disciplinary history. The investigation quietly shifted from examining one officer's behavior toward questioning supervisors who repeatedly allowed warning signs to disappear behind procedural language, administrative convenience, and unquestioned authority for years without meaningful oversight, without serious independent review or challenge ever. Senior officials initially expected another routine review, but growing evidence replaced certainty with unease. The deeper investigators searched, the harder earlier decisions became to defend, exposing cracks inside a system that trusted assumptions more than verification, transparency, responsibility, or honest accountability during critical moments despite repeated public warning signs beforehand. Every newly uncovered file strengthened the same conclusion. Independent complaints, witness statements, supervisory responses, and overlooked evidence consistently pointed toward recurring misconduct. Arguing Wallace's actions represented isolated mistakes became increasingly impossible as the accumulated record spoke with undeniable clarity before everyone present, across many years without meaningful intervention whatsoever anymore. After reviewing another thick folder, Sophia quietly closed the file and looked around the silent room. She finally said, "This isn't one mistake." Nobody challenged her conclusion. The silence itself became agreement, confirming everyone understood the investigation had uncovered something far larger than one officer again without further debate afterward. The silence inside internal affairs did not stay inside the building for long. By sunrise, carefully verified reports began appearing across every major news outlet. After days of unanswered questions, respected journalists confirmed the identity of the man removed from the restaurant. The elderly customer standing calmly in the rain was Justice Elijah Carter, a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court. Within minutes, every television network interrupted regular programming. Social media exploded with disbelief, and millions realized they had witnessed far more than another viral confrontation. People returned to the original video with different eyes. Every pause, every respectful answer, every moment Elijah remained calm now carried greater meaning. Viewers admitted they had assumed he was simply another customer because nothing about him announced power or status. The country slowly understood that the man standing silently in the rain had spent decades defending the Constitution, even while that same Constitution had failed to protect him from ordinary prejudice in an ordinary restaurant. News headlines quickly shifted. The discussion was no longer limited to one officer or one business. Editorials questioned racial profiling, police authority, and institutional accountability. National broadcasts invited legal experts, historians, and civil rights advocates to examine how quiet assumptions could produce public humiliation without anyone raising a voice. What began as a local incident had become a national reckoning about equality before the law. Political leaders released carefully written statements calling for transparency and accountability. Governors, senators, and mayors promised investigations and reform. Yet beneath the endless interviews and debates, ordinary families watched quietly from living rooms across America. Many asked themselves a painful question they could not ignore. If this could happen to a Supreme Court justice, what happened every day to people whose names no one recognized? Constitutional scholars explained that the issue reached far beyond one evening inside one restaurant. They argued that equal protection under the law depended upon evidence, not assumptions. When authority acted before truth, every citizen faced the same danger, regardless of education, profession, or reputation. Despite constant requests, Elijah declined every television interview. Reporters waited outside his office, but he offered no emotional speech and no public criticism. Instead, his office released one short written statement. "Justice begins where assumptions end." The sentence spread across the country within hours. It appeared on newspaper front pages, classroom whiteboards, church bulletins, and courthouse entrances. Without attacking anyone personally, Elijah reminded the nation that justice required humility before certainty. Meanwhile, public attention slowly moved beyond Officer Wallace himself. Citizens recognized that one officer alone could not create such a moment without systems that rewarded unquestioned authority. Across communities, thousands shared their own quiet stories of discrimination, finally believing someone might listen. The conversation had become larger than Elijah Carter. America was beginning to measure justice not by titles, wealth, or recognition, but by whether every stranger received the same dignity before anyone asked their name. Morning arrived with a different kind of silence than the one inside the restaurant days earlier. Outside the city oversight building, reporters lined the entrance while citizens waited patiently behind security barriers. Inside the hearing chamber, bright lights reflected across polished wooden desks as committee members, attorneys, journalists, and observers quietly found their seats. No one spoke louder than necessary. Everyone understood this hearing had grown beyond one disputed dinner. It had become a test of whether public institutions still deserved public trust. Officer Derek Wallace entered without hesitation. His uniform was pressed, his posture straight, and his expression carefully controlled. Years of surviving complaints had taught him that official procedure usually outweighed uncomfortable questions. He nodded briefly toward familiar faces in the room, expecting the system that had protected him before to do so once again. Yet the silence greeting him felt colder than confidence. Moments later, the restaurant manager was sworn in. He adjusted his tie before answering the committee's opening questions. "It was an unfortunate misunderstanding," he said carefully. "So there was no discriminatory intent?" an attorney asked. "Absolutely not." His voice remained steady, but his fingers tightened around the edge of the witness table. Every answer sounded rehearsed. Every pause lasted a second longer than the one before. The committee noticed. So did the reporters. Without dramatic arguments, attorneys projected a simple timeline onto the large courtroom screen. Dispatch records appeared beside surveillance timestamps. Phone recordings matched restaurant security footage minute by minute. Witness statements followed in careful order. No raised voices filled the room. Facts quietly assembled themselves into a picture that required no emotional performance. Committee members exchanged uneasy glances. Reporters lowered their pens to study the screen more closely. Even spectators who expected another ordinary government hearing leaned forward in silence. The evidence was beginning to speak without anyone forcing it. The young hostess was called next. She walked carefully to the witness chair, folded her hands together, and looked down for several seconds before answering the first question. "Were you instructed to remove Justice Carter?" "No, sir." "Did he threaten anyone?" "No." "Did he raise his voice?" She swallowed. "Never." Her quiet honesty carried more weight than any prepared statement. She avoided looking toward Wallace, but every truthful answer slowly separated her from the story others had expected her to repeat. Justice Elijah Carter remained seated throughout the testimony. He listened without interruption, offering only brief responses whenever attorneys requested clarification. His calm presence filled the room more completely than lengthy speeches ever could. The contrast between his restraint and everyone else's growing discomfort became impossible to ignore. Television cameras captured every subtle reaction. Tightened jaws, folded arms, nervous glances between attorneys. Reporters exchanged silent looks whenever another inconsistency appeared. The hearing had become a conversation told through expressions as much as words. Wallace noticed the change. Committee members no longer watched him with routine confidence. Instead, they listened more carefully to every witness who testified after him. For the first time since the restaurant encounter, uncertainty crossed his face before disappearing. Behind another practiced expression, the committee chair glanced across the room before announcing, "A brief recess. We will continue after reviewing additional evidence." No one rushed toward the exits. Conversations remained hushed. Everyone stayed seated, sensing the balance inside the hearing room had already shifted. The strongest testimony had not yet arrived, but the search for truth was no longer competing with reputation. It was quietly overtaking it. When the committee returned from recess, no one rushed to speak. The chair simply nodded toward the technician. Without introduction or commentary, the dispatch recording began playing through the hearing room speakers. Every caller's voice echoed across the chamber. Jurors, reporters, and spectators listened carefully. The recording described concern at the restaurant, yet nowhere did anyone confirm that a lawful trespass order had been issued. The missing detail stood out more loudly than any accusation. Facts had begun speaking for themselves. The next screen displayed security footage from inside the restaurant. The recording showed Elijah waiting quietly near the entrance, speaking respectfully to the hostess and remaining completely calm throughout the encounter. He never threatened anyone. He never shouted. He never resisted. Every frame quietly contradicted the official account that had justified removing him. The committee watched without interruption as the truth unfolded through ordinary moments captured without opinion or emotion. Former employees were then called one after another. Each witness appeared nervous, but each answered honestly. Were you told Justice Carter caused a disturbance? No. Did you personally witness threatening behavior? I didn't. Another employee lowered his head before speaking. We were expected to support management. His words lingered long after he finished. Years of silence slowly dissolved as ordinary workers chose honesty over fear, knowing the cameras now recorded more than their faces. They recorded their courage. The young hostess returned to the witness stand. The attorney asked one final question. In your own words, what happened that evening? She took a slow breath. He never caused any trouble. The room became perfectly still. No dramatic speech followed. Her quiet sentence carried greater weight than hours of argument. Even Wallace avoided looking toward her. For the first time, the hearing no longer felt divided between competing stories. It felt divided between truth and everything built to hide it. Attorneys calmly arranged dispatch logs, surveillance footage, written reports, and witness testimony into one complete timeline. Each document exposed another contradiction. Each contradiction weakened Wallace's report. Gaps that once seemed unimportant now connected into a pattern impossible to explain through misunderstanding alone. The restaurant manager attempted one final defense. It was a confusing situation. An attorney looked toward the witnesses. Everyone before you described the situation clearly. The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again. Every excuse had disappeared with the testimony that came before him. There was no employee left to blame and no confusion left to hide behind. Committee members gradually stopped writing notes. They simply watched, allowing the evidence to settle inside the room. Spectators who had entered expecting another contested hearing now sat in thoughtful silence. The balance of power had shifted without shouting, anger, or humiliation. By late afternoon, almost no one defended the original version of events. Missing records, consistent witness testimony, verified recordings, and documented timelines had stripped away every layer of confidence that once protected Wallace and the restaurant. No dramatic confession closed the hearing that day. Instead, deception collapsed quietly beneath patient investigation and undeniable evidence. Every lie fell without noise, yet everyone inside the chamber heard it break. Truth had not arrived through outrage or revenge. It arrived through calm voices, honest memories, and facts that refused to change no matter how desperately others wished they would. The committee chair adjusted the stack of binders one final time before looking across the hearing room. Every requested record had arrived except the document that had justified everything from the beginning. Investigators had searched department archives, restaurant files, digital databases, and handwritten logs. Nothing remained unchecked. The chair spoke evenly. Counsel, are we prepared to address the outstanding request? Yes, Madam Chair, a senior investigator stood. After reviewing every available record, we found no written trespass order connected to Justice Elijah Carter on the date of this incident. The statement lingered in the silence. An attorney leaned toward the microphone. To be absolutely clear, are you saying the document cannot be located? I'm saying it never existed. Several reporters stopped typing. Others slowly looked toward Officer Wallace. The committee's legal counsel opened another folder. We examined restaurant files, police records, incident reports, email correspondence, and archived communications. There is no signed trespass notice. There is no authorization form. There is no official approval. The chairman nodded once. So there is no document supporting the removal. None. Nobody interrupted. Another attorney activated the dispatch recording. The familiar voices echoed through the chamber. Dispatch acknowledged the call, requested routine information, and confirmed responding units. Nothing in the recording authorized a trespass order or instructed Officer Wallace to remove Elijah from the property. When the audio ended, the expert witness adjusted his glasses. "I have reviewed this recording multiple times. No verbal authorization was requested. None was granted. So dispatch never approved enforcement of a trespass order?" "Correct." Justice Elijah Carter remained motionless. The committee invited its constitutional advisor forward. "The law is straightforward," she began. "Without authorization from the property owner or a valid existing order, an officer has no legal basis to enforce trespass removal under these circumstances." She paused before continuing. "The Constitution requires lawful authority, not assumptions." Several committee members exchanged quiet looks. The lead investigator displayed Wallace's incident report beside the missing documentation request. The report references a trespass order. He clicked to another screen. "There is no supporting record." Another click. "No." Signature. Another. "No timestamp." Another. "No." Approval. He looked directly toward Wallace. Authority was claimed. It was never documented. The words settled heavily across the room. For the first time that morning, committee members stopped studying papers. Instead, they watched Wallace. His shoulders stiffened. His hands remained folded, but his fingers tightened against one another. No one raised a voice. In the gallery, spectators no longer whispered. They understood exactly what had happened. An elderly woman quietly wiped away tears. A young law student lowered her notebook. No explanation seemed necessary anymore. Across the room, the restaurant manager slowly removed his glasses. His attorney leaned close. "You don't have to respond." The manager barely nodded. "I should have asked to see it," he whispered. "What?" "I never saw the order either." His words barely carried beyond the table, but they reflected the truth more clearly than hours of testimony. The chairman acknowledged. The admission, without comment, Wallace finally lifted his eyes. For days he had defended procedure. For hours he had defended judgment. Now he faced something much harder. The investigation was no longer about an officer making a difficult decision under pressure. It was about acting with authority that had never legally existed. One committee member spoke, quietly. "If this document never existed, then every action taken afterward rests on a false foundation." "No," one challenged the statement. Years of unquestioned confidence suddenly looked fragile. The missing paper represented more than absent paperwork. It revealed a culture where unsupported claims had been accepted because they came from someone wearing a badge. Verification had been replaced by trust. Procedure had been replaced by assumption. Accountability had been postponed until evidence forced everyone to stop looking away. The chair glanced around the chamber before announcing a brief recess. No applause followed. No angry confrontation erupted, only silence remained. Yet inside that silence, every person present understood the hearing had already delivered its clearest conclusion. Long before any formal vote or recommendation, one truth stood untouched by argument. The trespass order had never existed. The chairman looked toward Justice Elijah Carter and gave a respectful nod. "Justice Carter, if you wish to address the committee, the floor is yours." For the first time that day, Elijah slowly rose from his chair. No papers rested in his hands. No prepared statement waited on the table. The room became so still that even reporters lowered their keyboards. Every eye followed him, not because he wore the title of Supreme Court Justice, but because they sensed they were about to hear the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime choosing restraint over resentment. "Thank you," Elijah began quietly. "I appreciate the committee's patience and the careful work that has been done here today." He paused before continuing. "I did not come to this restaurant expecting to become part of a national story. I came hoping to enjoy a quiet meal after speaking with young law students." His voice never rose. "I have listened to every witness. I have watched every recording. I have no desire to add anger where truth has already spoken. He glanced around the chamber. The facts are now clear. They deserve to remain stronger than anyone's emotions. Another brief silence settled over the room. This story did not begin inside that restaurant. Several committee members leaned forward. It began many years before that evening. It began in ordinary moments when people decided who belonged before asking a single question. It began with quiet suspicion that slowly became accepted as normal. Elijah folded his hands. When I was a boy, my father often told me, never let another person's hatred decide the kind of man you become. A faint smile crossed his face. I did not fully understand those words then. I do now. He looked toward the audience instead of Officer Wallace. Throughout my life, I have learned that prejudice rarely arrives with shouting. Most of the time, it walks through the front door wearing ordinary clothes. It appears in doubtful looks, silent assumptions, selective rules, and decisions made without curiosity or compassion. The gallery remained silent. Humiliation only wins when it changes who you are. His words were calm, yet they carried through every corner of the chamber. If another person's prejudice convinces you to abandon kindness, discipline, or integrity, then the injustice continues long after. The moment itself has ended. He slowly turned toward the committee. I do not believe this hearing is only about one. Officer, nobody interrupted. It is about every institution that begins trusting certainty more than evidence. Systems fail quietly whenever assumptions replace questions, whenever procedures become less important than appearances, and whenever dignity depends on who people think you are instead of who you truly are. When Elijah returned to his seat, the silence that followed carried more weight than applause ever could. Elijah remained standing for another moment, allowing his previous words to settle naturally instead of rushing toward another conclusion. Around the chamber, people no longer looked only at him. They looked inward. A reporter remembered dismissing a frightened witness years earlier. A committee member recalled an elderly neighbor quietly avoiding certain stores. Even spectators found themselves thinking about strangers they had judged without knowing their stories. The hearing had become more than testimony. It had become a mirror. Elijah spoke again. Institutions do not collapse in one day. His voice stayed calm. They weaken through small compromises repeated so often that they begin feeling ordinary. One ignored complaint, one overlooked warning, one shortcut accepted because it seems easier than asking difficult questions. Eventually, people stop believing the system will protect them equally. Several committee members slowly nodded. He continued. When trust disappears, rebuilding it takes far longer than losing it. The room remained completely still. Elijah paused before delivering his final thought. The badge was never the problem. Every reporter instinctively looked up. The certainty was, pen stopped. Moving television commentators sitting behind the cameras exchanged silent glances. The sentence reached beyond Officer Wallace. It challenged every institution that allowed confidence to replace evidence. Elijah turned toward Wallace for the first time. I do not question your humanity. Officer. Wallace looked up slowly. I question what happens when certainty arrives before curiosity. When we stop asking questions, we stop seeing people. Wallace swallowed but said nothing. No accusation followed. No anger filled the space between them. That silence forced Wallace to face his own choices without hiding behind defensiveness or resentment. Elijah stepped back from the microphone. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Committee members remained motionless. Spectators sat with lowered eyes. Even the camera operators hesitated before adjusting their equipment, unwilling to disturb the weight hanging over the room. The chairman quietly cleared his throat, but even that small sound seemed unusually loud. Everyone understood the hearing had changed. It was no longer only an investigation into one encounter outside a restaurant. It had become a national reflection on dignity, responsibility, and the unseen cost of assumptions. People with different political beliefs, legal opinions, and personal experiences struggled to disagree with what they had heard because Elijah had offered neither ideology nor personal revenge. He had offered truth. As Elijah returned to his seat, Wallace stared ahead in silence while millions continued watching the live broadcast. No applause interrupted the moment. History had shifted through measured words instead of raised voices, and everyone present knew they would remember that silence long after the hearing ended. As Justice Carter quietly returned to his seat, no one rushed to fill the silence. The committee prepared its notes, reporters reviewed their recordings, and spectators remained unusually still. Yet the loudest conversation was unfolding inside Officer Derek Wallace's own mind. Every witness had spoken. Every document had been examined. Every explanation had been tested. For the first time since entering the restaurant, he found himself without another answer waiting to be spoken. The confidence that had carried him into the hearing slowly slipped away. Earlier that morning, he had sat upright with steady shoulders and practiced certainty. Now his posture sagged almost without notice. Each careful breath felt heavier than the last. The evidence had not defeated him through shouting. It had worn away every place his certainty once stood. Beneath the witness table, Wallace quietly folded his hands together. Moments later, he pulled them apart again. His fingers trembled despite every effort to keep them still. Cameras remained focused elsewhere, but he could no longer ignore what his own body revealed. Fear had found its way into movements his face struggled to hide. The familiar explanations repeated endlessly over the past week echoed inside his thoughts. Procedure, judgment, public safety. Each phrase sounded weaker than before. None matched the recordings. None survived the testimony. For the first time, the story he had defended no longer convinced even the man telling it. When committee members looked toward him, Wallace lowered his eyes. He avoided the witnesses. He avoided Justice Carter. Even brief eye contact carried a weight he could no longer bear. Trust had quietly disappeared, leaving only disappointment reflected back at him. Around the chamber, former colleagues remained silent. No reassuring nods came his way. During the short recess, uniformed officers walked past without stopping. Some turned toward other conversations. Others simply continued walking. Across the room, the restaurant manager finally spoke without excuses. "I made choices too," he admitted quietly. This wasn't only confusion. "I should have stopped it." Those words removed Wallace's final shelter. For the first time, both men sat alone with the decisions only they could answer for. Wallace remained seated as the hearing room slowly emptied for the afternoon recess. Around him, chairs shifted, folders closed, and quiet conversations drifted toward the hallway. Yet his thoughts refused to leave the restaurant. They carried him back to the beginning, replaying every moment with painful precision. He saw Elijah step through the entrance wearing an ordinary suit. He heard himself issue commands before asking questions. He remembered the calm voice asking, "May I see that order?" Then came the firm grip on Elijah's arm. At the time, each decision had felt routine. Now, every second revealed another chance to choose differently. His eyes settled on the badge still pinned neatly to his uniform. For years, it had represented authority, discipline, and confidence. Today, it felt different. It no longer symbolized only legal power. It carried the trust strangers placed in officers they had never met. It carried the responsibility to slow down before acting. It carried consequences that reached far beyond one evening inside a restaurant. The weight pressing against his chest seemed heavier than the metal itself. Justice Carter had never called him cruel, had never questioned his worth as a human being. That mercy became harder to endure than anger would have been if Elijah had shouted or insulted him. Wallace could have hidden behind wounded pride. Instead, he had been treated with the same dignity he failed to offer someone else. Compassion stripped away every excuse. Until only responsibility remained, his lips moved. Almost without sound, "I never thought." The words faded before another sentence could follow. He lowered his head. There was nothing left to explain. Television cameras quietly captured his expression. Viewers across the country did not see defiance or outrage. They saw a man sitting alone with the consequences of his own decisions. His silence looked painfully human, yet it never erased the harm already done. Inside the chamber, committee members quietly resumed organizing documents for the next session. No verdict had been announced. No punishment had yet been imposed. Still, everyone sensed accountability had already begun. Wallace's hardest sentence would not come from any official recommendation. It had started the moment evidence forced him to stop. Arguing with the truth, no one hurried. To break the silence surrounding him, it became the first honest moment of the entire investigation as the hearing adjourned for the day. Wallace remained seated while reporters gathered outside and spectators slowly disappeared into the evening. His unfinished words echoed louder than every explanation he had offered before. For years he believed certainty justified authority. Now he understood that justice demanded something far greater: humility before the facts, respect for every person, and complete responsibility for every decision made while wearing the badge. The committee chair adjusted the microphone before reading the final findings. Every sentence echoed across the hearing room with measured calm. No applause followed. No one celebrated. Reporters stopped typing for a moment while spectators quietly absorbed the decision. Accountability had finally arrived, not as revenge against one individual, but as an acknowledgement that public trust could only survive when truth mattered more than reputation. Justice Carter remained seated, his expression unchanged, offering neither satisfaction nor resentment as another. Difficult chapter reached its conclusion. Officer Derek Wallace accepted the official termination notice with steady hands that no longer carried confidence. He removed his badge, placed it carefully inside a small evidence envelope, and nodded once. No arguments escaped his lips. No cameras captured angry protests. Years of unquestioned authority ended in complete silence. As he walked from the chamber, he understood that losing the badge was only the visible consequence. The heavier burden would be living with the choices that had brought him there. Within hours, state prosecutors confirmed a formal criminal investigation into Wallace's conduct. Internal discipline had exposed the facts, but legal accountability required its own independent path. Officials emphasized that the investigation would follow evidence wherever it led, reinforcing a principle Elijah had defended throughout his career. No office, title, or uniform should ever place someone beyond the reach of the law they promised to uphold. The restaurant faced consequences of its own. Longtime business partners quietly suspended relationships, choosing distance over public statements. Several respected organizations withdrew sponsorships without dramatic announcements, recognizing that confidence earned over decades could disappear when leadership failed during a moment demanding fairness, courage, and integrity. Silence accomplished what press conferences never could. Civil attorneys soon filed lawsuits representing customers and former employees whose experiences reflected similar patterns of discrimination. Public outrage gradually gave way to orderly legal proceedings. Court filings replaced emotional television debates, ensuring that justice would continue through established institutions rather than through anger alone. The focus shifted from punishment toward responsibility, documentation, and lasting reform. Behind closed boardroom doors, corporate executives replaced senior management and approved sweeping operational changes. Employees noticed new reporting systems, mandatory bias training, and written documentation for every removal decision. Workers who had once feared speaking honestly found supervisors encouraging transparency instead of silence. Everyday routines slowly changed, proving meaningful reform often begins through consistent small decisions rather than dramatic promises. Throughout every announcement, Justice Carter refused interviews celebrating Wallace's downfall. He released no triumphant statements and sought no personal victory. His quiet restraint reminded the nation that justice is fulfilled by correcting systems, protecting dignity, and preventing future harm, not by humiliating those who have already been held accountable. As public trust slowly began rebuilding, the strongest lesson remained unchanged. Lasting accountability rises gradually like sunrise, bringing light without demanding applause. The committee's decisions slowly faded from newspaper headlines, television broadcasts, and online discussions. Public attention moved toward newer stories. But for Derek Wallace, nothing truly moved forward. He unlocked the front door of his house and stepped into a silence that felt unfamiliar. The rooms were exactly as he had left them, yet they no longer felt like home. Without morning briefings, patrol schedules, or the weight of a badge resting on his belt, every hour seemed longer than the one before. Consequences had arrived quietly, settling into the ordinary spaces of daily life where cameras could no longer follow. Unable to sleep, Wallace sat alone in his living room with his phone resting in his hands. He scrolled through old family photographs taken over many years. Birthdays filled with laughter, graduations marked by proud smiles, vacations where everyone stood shoulder to shoulder before beautiful sunsets. Each picture reminded him of a man who believed he understood responsibility. Somewhere between those happy memories and the hearing room, confidence had slowly replaced humility. Looking at his younger self, he wondered when certainty had become stronger than compassion without him ever recognizing the change. The next afternoon, he called his daughter once again. The phone rang several times before reaching voicemail. He listened without leaving a message. There had been no angry arguments between them, no harsh words spoken after the hearing. Only distance remained. That quiet separation hurt more than shouting ever could. Sitting with the silent phone in his hand, Wallace realized that some relationships fade not because people stop caring, but because disappointment becomes too heavy for ordinary conversation. A few days later, he walked through the neighborhood he had known for years. Familiar sidewalks, familiar trees, familiar houses surrounded him, yet everything felt strangely different. Neighbors who once greeted him with warm smiles now offered brief nods before continuing on their way. Others pretended not to notice him at all. No one confronted him. No one insulted him. Still, every avoided glance reminded him that trust, once broken, rarely returns quickly. The weeks that followed brought even quieter losses. Friends answered fewer messages. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations that once came naturally disappeared without explanation. Wallace gradually understood that many friendships had depended upon the respect attached to his position rather than the strength of personal character. Without the uniform, those connections quietly dissolved, leaving him surrounded by memories instead of companionship. Across the city, the former restaurant manager experienced a similar loneliness. He packed framed certificates, family photographs, and office supplies into a cardboard box before leaving the building for the last time. Every empty shelf reflected years spent protecting appearances instead of confronting uncomfortable truths. The polished office that had once represented success now echoed with silence. Although Wallace and the former manager never met again, both men spent long evenings reflecting on the choices that had brought them there. Public attention had disappeared. Reporters had moved on. The hardest part of accountability had finally begun. Wallace stopped searching for excuses that protected his pride. Instead, he accepted the painful truth that growth begins only after every justification loses its power. As he placed another family photograph face down on the table, he understood the deepest consequence was not losing his career. It was knowing one unquestioned decision had changed countless lives forever, including his own. Months after the hearings concluded, life slowly settled into a quieter rhythm. Television crews stopped waiting outside government buildings, newspapers found newer headlines, and public attention drifted elsewhere. Justice Elijah Carter welcomed the silence. Rather than accepting invitations to appear on national talk shows or participate in public celebrations, he returned to the university classroom where rows of eager students waited with notebooks instead of cameras. Standing before them, he smiled warmly and opened his constitutional law lecture exactly as he had for years. He believed history was not changed by speeches delivered under bright lights, but by minds prepared to defend justice long after the applause faded. Every lecture carried a deeper meaning than before. Elijah never centered the restaurant incident or spoke about himself unless a student directly asked. Instead, he challenged future attorneys to question assumptions before reaching conclusions. He reminded them that every court opinion, police decision, and legal argument eventually touched someone's family, dignity, and future. Laws existed on paper, but justice lived in human choices. His calm voice never demanded admiration. It simply invited careful thinking, leaving students with lessons that remained long after class had ended. Outside the university, Elijah devoted many afternoons to neighborhood legal clinics, youth centers, and community workshops. He listened patiently as parents described housing disputes, workers discussed discrimination, and teenagers asked questions about their constitutional rights. He answered each concern with patience instead of legal jargon. Before leaving every gathering, he reminded them that understanding their rights was not about preparing for conflict. It was about protecting their dignity before conflict ever appeared. Across the city, Maya Johnson graduated from law school carrying a different purpose than the one she had imagined years earlier. Recording that rainy evening outside the restaurant had changed more than a national conversation. It had changed her own future. She joined a civil rights organization, dedicating herself to representing families whose voices were often ignored. Whenever young interns asked what inspired her career, she spoke not about viral videos or public recognition, but about one quiet man who answered injustice with dignity instead of anger. Inspired by the hearings, many young people entered law schools, journalism programs, and public service with renewed determination. They remembered Elijah's steady composure more clearly than any dramatic courtroom exchange. His example taught them that careful truth, respectful persistence, and moral courage could expose injustice more effectively than outrage alone. They carried those lessons into classrooms, newsrooms, and government offices across the country. Meanwhile, practical reforms slowly began taking shape. Government agencies introduced stricter documentation requirements for trespass orders and police interactions, ensuring important decisions required clear written records. Independent civilian review boards expanded their authority, examining complaints through transparent processes rather than relying solely on internal investigations. Departments also strengthened body camera preservation rules so critical evidence could no longer disappear without explanation. Honest officers welcomed the changes, recognizing that reliable documentation protected both the public and those who served with integrity. The greatest transformation, however, unfolded far from hearing rooms in government offices. In ordinary workplaces, classrooms, neighborhoods, and dinner tables, people began asking better questions before accepting easy assumptions. Employees felt safer reporting misconduct. Students challenged stereotypes with confidence. Citizens grew more willing to speak when something felt wrong instead of waiting for someone else to act. Standing at the classroom window after another lecture, Elijah watched his students leave together, hopeful conversations filling the hallway. He understood that justice would never be finished. It would continue every day. Wherever ordinary people chose dignity before assumption, truth before comfort, and courage before silence. Several months passed before Justice Elijah Carter found himself standing once again outside the historic restaurant. The evening air felt calm as he paused for a brief moment, studying the familiar entrance where so much had quietly changed. Memories returned without bitterness. He remembered the unanswered questions, the silent assumptions, and the long walk into the rain. Those moments had altered many lives, yet they no longer controlled his heart. Taking one slow breath, Elijah adjusted his jacket and stepped through the doorway with the same quiet confidence he had carried on that first evening. Inside, the polished wood floors, soft lighting, and elegant decor appeared almost untouched. At first glance, nothing seemed different. Yet the atmosphere carried a warmth that had been missing before. New ownership had reshaped more than policies. It had changed expectations. Employees greeted each guest with equal professionalism, treating courtesy not as a privilege but as a standard. Respect no longer depended on appearance, reputation, or assumptions. It simply belonged to everyone who entered. A young hostess approached Elijah with a welcoming smile. "Good evening, sir. Table for one?" she asked gently. "Yes, thank you," Elijah replied. "Right this way." There were no awkward pauses, whispered conversations, or uncertain glances. She led him through the dining room exactly as she would any other guest. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet it restored something far greater than comfort. Sometimes dignity returned through ordinary kindness rather than public apologies. As Elijah looked around, he recognized familiar tables, quiet conversations, and the same large windows overlooking the street. The silence inside the restaurant no longer carried suspicion. It felt peaceful, allowing guests to enjoy simple moments without invisible judgments shaping every interaction. That quiet change spoke louder than any ceremony ever could. Outside, there were no television cameras, reporters, or curious crowds waiting for another headline. The absence of attention brought Elijah genuine peace. Real victories, he had learned, were never measured by how many people watched them. They were measured by what continued after everyone stopped watching. Throughout the evening, servers treated every customer with equal patience and courtesy. Elijah noticed written procedures posted discreetly near the service station, reminding employees that fairness was expected in every decision. Policies alone could not create character, but consistent habits could slowly reshape culture. That steady commitment mattered more than carefully crafted public statements. Elijah chose a quiet table beside the window, enjoying his meal without interruption. Sitting alone did not feel lonely. Instead, it reminded him that dignity had never depended upon titles, recognition, or approval from strangers. The Constitution protected ordinary moments like this one because ordinary people deserved extraordinary respect. As dinner ended, Elijah quietly reflected on everything the journey had revealed. Justice was never measured by the power to remove someone from a room. It was measured by the courage to ensure they never should have been removed in the first place. Leaving a generous tip behind, he stood, glanced once across the peaceful dining room, and walked toward the door. The trespass order had never existed. The truth always had. And once truth finally found its place at the table, fear could never ask it to leave again.